8 million Guatemalans head to the polls on Sunday to vote on general elections. Brazilian workers held the first general strike against President Jair Bolsonaro. And South Africa celebrates Youth Month and the legacy of the student struggle. Hello and welcome to Telesur English. I am Estefania Bravo. This is from the South. Workers in Brazil held the first general strike against the government of President Jair Bolsonaro on Friday. In the city of Rio, protesters were met with heavy police repression as citizens took to the streets nationwide. From midnight on Friday, trade unionists across the country walked off the job. The strike was called on May Day by all the main union federations and focused mainly on Bolsonaro's attempts to push through a pension reform, which they say will make it difficult for many workers to retire.
Brazil awoke today to its first general strike against far-right President Jair Bolsonaro and his neoliberal pension reforms. Towns and cities across the country ground to a halt. The work stoppages were coupled with hundreds of actions to shut down the morning rush hour traffic. One of these interventions took place on Avenida 23 de Maio in downtown São Paulo.
We closed down the avenue because this is an important day. Everyone should know how important the retirement system is, especially for the youth, women, and rural workers. People are protesting across the country. This is a historic day. It will affect us for years in terms of human rights and in terms of the quality of life for the Brazilian working class, and especially for young people like myself.
According to CUT Union Confederation President Wagner Freitas, the goal of this strike was not to hold giant street protests like those during the May education strikes, but for workers to stay home in protest of the proposed capitalization of Brazil's pension fund, which is based on the failed Chilean model. The strike is one of several tactics, including pressuring local lawmakers, that Brazil's union confederations are using to try to block the measure, which, if passed, will raise the retirement age and lower pension checks well below minimum wage.
We know that this pension reform is a fraud, it's a lie, and the working class is going to pay a high price for it. That is why we are out here.
Building on the momentum of the May education strikes and the political crisis caused by new revelations of fraud in last year's presidential elections, today's strike is yet another example of rising resistance to the Bolsonaro government. Brian Mir, Telesur, São Paulo.
Brazil's lower house has called upon the editor of The Intercept, Glenn Greenwald, to appear before its Human Rights Commission to answer questions related to the Lava Jato operation. Greenwald was called to give his testimony on the audios and messages leaked to The Intercept, which unveiled the political machinations behind the operation. According to the leaks, current Justice Minister Sergio Moro and prosecutor Deltan Dallagnol plotted against former President Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva to impede his candidacy in the 2018 presidential elections. Greenwald's testimony will be held next Thursday.
So the Western media has long...
And in his first interview after these revelations, former President Luiz Ignacio Lula da Silva once again condemned the relationship between the U.S. government and the Lava Jato operation.
How many companies were destroyed by their adventure? Was it not possible to pursue corruption without taking business to bankruptcy? You could remove the owner of the company, but allow it to continue its operations, like Samsung and Volkswagen continue to work in Germany. Why destroy companies? Why demoralize Petrobras and destroy it? Today I want to take this space to say, this transpired because Moro, Dallagnol, and Lava Jato serve America's interests rather than the interest of combating corruption.
At least 6,000 National Guard officers are now stationed at Mexico's southern border in an operation which began on Tuesday as part of the agreement signed with Washington. Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard provided the update during the president's Friday morning news conference. He said that they will meet with the U.S. to talk about the entry points and the number of migrants who are requesting asylum in the United States. Meanwhile, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador says that they will safeguard the well-being of migrants.
The more efficient and most human way to face the migratory phenomenon in the United States and in any other country or region of the world is by attending to the reasons which are at the root of why people have to leave their native places. This should not be resolved with force or with coercive measures.
Close to 8 million Guatemalans will head to the polls on Sunday to vote on general elections. 26 parties are in the running for the presidential race. On top of that, 340 mayors, 160 Congress members, and 20 parliamentary ministers are to be elected. Among those leading the polls for president are Sandra Torres, representative of the Social Democratic Party, National Union of Hope, Alejandro Yamatei of the newly established Vamos Party, and Roberto Arzu of the right-wing PAN Podemos. So let's have a closer look at some of the main candidates. Thelma Cabrera of the MLP is the only indigenous female candidate. She has a long history as a leader of CODECA, the Campesino Development Committee fighting against racism and poverty. She wants a fresh start for the country with a constituent assembly to refound the Guatemalan state. Thelma Cabrera's main political philosophy is the indigenous principle of good living. And this is the fourth time that Alejandro Yamatei is running for office, but the first under his own party, the right-wing Vamos. His main proposal is the creation of jobs to fight poverty. Yamatei is also proposing to attract foreign investors and apply policies of public and private partnerships. On top of this, he proposes the expansion of free trade zones. And Sandra Torres was the first lady from 2008 until 2011, and this is the third time she is running for office. She has proposed strengthening policies to fight corruption. Security remains a big issue in Guatemala. To improve this, Torres has suggested deploying the army to the streets and to push a reform in the prison system. And to talk more about these elections, we are joined live by Alex Eichenstadt, a Guatemalan attorney and expert in constitutional and international law. Alex, thank you so much for your time for Telesur English.
Thank you very much for having me.
Alex, these elections are marked by a high percentage of voter indecision and lack of trust for candidates. Why do you think this is?
Well, I'd say this is one of the elections with less certainty we've had in Guatemala. A change in the constitutional rules regarding who can be a candidate, but also a change in the interpretation of those rules has as a consequence that many of the preferred candidates have not been allowed to enter the elections. And so that has affected people's enthusiasm.
You mentioned a lot has been said about the road to Sunday's vote. As you mentioned, some potential candidates have been left out of the ballot due to corruption allegations, and some even were arrested. What is your opinion about the recent electoral scenario in Guatemala?
Well, as you said, some have had criminal charges against them, but even some of the ones running have criminal charges against them. For example, Sandra Torres has a case against her presented by the International Commission Against Impunity and local prosecutors. But also there has been a change in some ways the Constitution has been interpreted. For example, Suri Rios, who is a daughter of a former general that led a coup, was not allowed to run this time because she was the daughter of this general. However, she was allowed to run 4 years ago. So there's not really any certainty about who gets to be allowed to run. And most of these decisions have been taken weeks ago. So people don't really even know who's going to be in the ballot.
Now, Alex, citizens are mostly concerned about poverty rate, insecurity, and the high levels of migration. What can Guatemala's next president do to tackle these problems?
Well, there are many things that they can do. This problem is growing. As you know, there are thousands of Central American migrants, especially in the United States, and Mexico is taking a stronger role and a tougher role against Central American migrants on that role. But I think the main thing is to address the causes of migration, and those are mainly lack of security and poverty. So it's really important to address that. You know, Guatemala has the highest rate of child malnutrition in the American continent, and that cannot continue to be so.
Alex, we thank you so much for Telesur English, for your time for Telesur English.
My pleasure.
We have been speaking with Alex Eisenstadt, a Guatemalan attorney on Guatemala's general elections that will take place on Sunday. And now let's take a short break now, but when we come back, South Africa is celebrating Youth Month to honor demonstrations that led to the fall of apartheid. Welcome back. Sudan's acting prosecutor has announced that ousted President Omar al-Bashir will appear in court to corruption charges. Without specifying details, Al-Walid Sayed Ahmed also says that criminal cases have been opened against 41 other former officials. Ahmed added that investigations launched against Bashir have been completed. The announcement comes more than 2 months after the military overthrew Bashir and following months of nationwide unrest against his 30-year rule. About 30 soldiers in Benin have been wounded following days of protests over controversial parliamentary elections held back in April. Gunfire was exchanged between soldiers and mass protesters on Friday. The demonstrators demand the lifting of a police cordon around former President Boni Yayi's house in Katandou. Boni Yayi has been kept under house arrest since the polls for supporting the protests against the elections. Political tension has run high in the West African nation since April, as only 2 parties were allowed to run, both loyal to President Patrice Talon.
Comme lors des faits déplorés,
Offenders have set fires to homes, whose inhabitants were only saved thanks to the promptness and dedication of the defense and security forces. These same offenders burned down the local police station and blocked traffic in both directions on the Cotonou-Malanville interstate road.
A pair of explosions rocked Somalia's capital and left at least 10 people dead as the Al-Shabaab armed group claimed responsibility. Another 16 people are wounded as the first car bomb went off near the parliament building. According to officials, the second bomb went off near a checkpoint on the road to a heavily fortified airport. Al-Shabaab fighters say the blasts were meant to strike the first line of security checkpoints for the airport and parliament, where most diplomats reside. In South Africa, June is known as Youth Month to honor young people who took part in mass demonstrations in 1976 that contributed to the fall of apartheid. The country was eventually liberated from white minority rule in 1994, but to this day, the youth of South Africa continues to push for social and economic justice. In recent years, university students made international headlines when they launched a campaign for free tertiary education. Mpo Lakaji reports from Johannesburg.
With an economy battling to grow, joblessness in South Africa is reaching unbearable levels. Some people now have to dig really deep and even compete with animals for food. Education is the only hope out of suffering. But even among those who found a way into university, poverty seems inescapable.
We saw too many students eating 1 meal a week, 2 meals a week, looking in dustbins for food, looking for funding for higher education when they were talented enough to succeed.
And to solve this problem, student leaders have tried hard over the years to have the education system overhauled.
In the whole country, I mean, universities, University of Fort Walter Sisulu University, every year would go on strikes for months, and sometimes universities would be shut completely and students would be sent home because of fees. So this is a broader social issue.
It's not that there's no financial assistance for university students from poor backgrounds. Organizations like the National Student Financial Aid Scheme fund thousands of indigent students. But the problem is that the money isn't enough to cover costs for basic necessities like food, transport, and accommodation. And with tuition fees going up every year, learners became frustrated.
Our universities need to be a space for social change. There needs to be a space in which you can escape poverty, but also a space in which you can become good citizens for the country and understand your social responsibility.
Around 2015, as another increase in tuition fees loomed, student leaders here at Wits University launched a campaign known as Fees Must Fall.
And it became quite popular on social media. And once it became popular on social media, it became beyond. It went beyond just being a conversation among students, but a national issue that the country needed to decide.
The Fees Must Fall movement started small, but in no time, South Africans watched on TV as thousands of students demonstrated against the increase in tuition fees. The national campaign morphed into a call for free education. And like the student uprising of 1976 in Soweto, this one also had ugly scenes.
We have police on campus probably for the first time since the end of apartheid, right? And you have heavy-handed tactics being used by private security. There are rumors of people from the state coming to student protests to collapse the student movement. And that's where students become angry. Students take up stones.
The stalemate between students, government, and university management went on for weeks.
On the matter at hand, we agreed.
But in December 2017, former President Jacob Zuma announced that higher education would finally be free. Just like the class of 1976, who helped to topple apartheid through demonstrations, the current generation scored an important victory.
What we did is we played a pass to the next generation of student leaders that's closer to the goalposts. And now it's up to those who come after us to score the goal.
Across the world, you had many struggles that are led by young people. Thomas Sankara took over leadership when he was young. The ANC was formed by a 31-year-old, and it was the generation of the youth of the ANC in the 1960s that took over the leadership of the ANC and changed the direction of the ANC, and that led eventually to this democracy that we have. So there are many points of inspiration that young people had. But 1976 was quite peculiar and powerful because it was much younger people at the time.
Polagaje, Telesu, Johannesburg.
Coming up after the break, people in London marched to commemorate the 2-year anniversary since the Grenfell tragedy. Don't go away. The 5th summit of the Conference on Interaction and Confidence-Building Measures in Asia is currently underway in Tajikistan. Heads of state from across the Asian continent are attending the meeting, among them Chinese President Xi Jinping and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. As the summit got underway, both leaders expressed their desire to open new chapters in promoting a China-Turkey strategic cooperative relationship. During his speech at the opening of the SICA, President Xi said China will pursue a peaceful shared development opportunities with all countries through the Belt and Road Initiative.
China will stay committed to the path of peaceful development and reject harming others to benefit itself. China will continue to deepen friendships and cooperation with other countries and pursue peaceful settlements to disputes over territorial sovereignty and maritime rights and interests with the relevant countries. China will stay committed to opening up for win-win outcomes and shared development opportunities with other countries. We will stay committed to practicing multilateralism to safeguard the international order underpinned by international law.
Floods caused by torrential rains have killed at least 19 people in southern China. According to officials, week-long downpours in the Huangxi region triggered floods in 6 cities, affecting more than 570,000 people. Across the region, houses have collapsed and crops have been badly damaged. Following days of violent protests, Hong Kong's chief executive has officially suspended a controversial extradition bill. The bill was proposed by the government as a measure to fix recently discovered loopholes, which would allow Hong Kong to become a haven for fugitives of the law.
I now announce that the government has decided to suspend the legislative amendment exercise, restart our communication with all sectors of society, do more explanation work, and listen to different views of society. This bill has very laudable objectives, not only domestically but also internationally. The enactment of this bill will help to raise Hong Kong's international profile and also demonstrate that we are a place with excellent rule of law, not only for our own citizens, but also in contribution to the combating of serious crime on a cross-border and transnational basis.
Thousands of people took part in a silent march of remembrance in London to mark 2 years since the Grenfell Tower fire, which killed 72 people. The Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn accompanied the march. Before the walk, survivors and relatives released doves and green balloons to honor the victims. The marchers then made their way through the streets of North Kensington, near where the tower is located.
Friday marked the 2-year anniversary of the Grenfell Tower fire in West London, which resulted in 72 people dying. In the local community, there is frustration and anger against the British government because of the scant support they have received, the lack of accountability for the failings that led to the tragedy, and because there is a sense that a similar accident could take place again elsewhere.
If people are responsible for putting up cladding which killed people, not only did it burn very fast, but I hear now that the resin, the plastic resin, was also dead. The toxicity across the area, everybody has suffered. Everybody. I have friends who are now facing a death sentence from what they've inhaled.
As part of the commemorations for the second anniversary, the community and its supporters marched silently through the streets of the neighbourhood, as they do on every 14th of the month since the fire occurred. An estimated 11,000 people attended the silent march, including Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn.
We have not seen any arrests, and in fact the other day the police said while they had questioned some people under caution, they said that there wouldn't necessarily be any charges brought. This is completely unacceptable to us here. Not only are we fighting for the legacy of the people that died, and I'll tell you something, we won't betray the dead, because a betrayal of the dead would be tantamount to a betrayal of the living.
Impunity for those that made decisions that meant that so many died in the fire is a concern for many in the local community. With an ongoing government inquiry into the tragedy not expected to be finalised until 2021, there is a real fear that no one will be held accountable. In West London, those commemorating the second anniversary of the tragedy came out in numbers, dignified and defiant. Pablo Navarrete, Telesur, London.
And we continue with our coverage of the Cricket World Cup. In today's first match, Australia won by 87 runs against Sri Lanka at the Oval. Sri Lanka won the toss and decided to bowl. And Australia moves to the top of the World Cup group table after bold hits from Aaron Finch and Mitchell Starc, who secured an 87-run win. This was Sri Lanka's second defeat in the last 5 games, having had their first 2 fixtures abandoned without a ball being bowled, leaving their quest for a semi-final place in question. And for the second match, South Africa revived their World Cup hopes with a 9-wicket victory over Afghanistan in Cardiff. Having failed to win any of their first 4 matches, South Africa dismissed Afghanistan by 125 after 2 rain delays cut the match to 48 overs. The game saw South Africa's fast bowler Dale Steyn ruled out for the rest of the tournament due to injury. Afghanistan have lost all 4 matches and remain last in the 10-team standing. And with that story, we've come to the end of this news brief. These and other stories, as always, find them on our website at telestorenglish.net. And also join us on social media. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesur English, I am Stefania Bravo. Thank you for watching.